younger brains. So Ivette Planell-Mendez is a graduate student with Sabine Castaner in Princeton, a lab that's well known for never stopped producing beautiful science. And I myself had the honor to visit the Castaner lab in 2016. And since then, a series of important work have further established the role of frontal parietal thetaism in attention. And I'm more than excited to hear about what's new. So Ivette, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'll be sharing a project that I'm currently working on looking at the rhythmic properties of attention across development. Attention is crucial for selectively processing information in the visual field, and it has been classically viewed as a movable spotlight that focuses in on an area of interest. Recent research has shown that this spotlight isn't constant, but rather flickers, allowing you to flexibly alternate between periods of high perceptual sensitivity and periods of lower perceptual sensitivity. The latter period allows for a higher probability of shifting your attention towards something outside of your spotlight that might have become relevant. In adults, this rhythmicity of attention is in the theta range, or 3 to 8 hertz. This rhythmic property of attention is very useful. For example, if you are in your room working on your Where's Waldo puzzles, this rhythmicity allows you to rapidly alternate between perceptually sensitive periods during which you are more likely to find Waldo, and periods where you are more aware of your surroundings and are thereby able to notice if anyone is sneaking up on you. This process has been studied in non-human primates and adults, but to date, nothing is known about whether or not it is present from an early age or if it has a protracted development over the course of childhood. In this study, we're looking at children ages 6 to 8 and 11 to 13 to understand the development of this rhythmic property of attention. We hypothesize that the frequency of this rhythmicity becomes more adult-like with age. To understand this question, we've implemented a dot cloud task from Ivette Landau's group. In this task, participants foveally attend to a drifting blue dot cloud stimulus. After a random interval of time, a drifting red dot cloud appears. The appearance of the red dot cloud functions as a cue, and 250 to 750 milliseconds after this cue onset, either the blue or the red dot cloud slightly decreases in color saturation. The participant must accurately detect this color change, and we perform a thresholding procedure with each participant to make the task challenging enough that they can do this accurately only about 75% of the time. The key part of this task that allows us to probe the rhythmicity is the cue target interval. By varying this period, we present the color change during different phases of perceptual sensitivity, and this is reflected in the participant's performance. To make the task engaging for kids, we've embedded it into a fun game where an astronaut named May is decoding secret messages on different planets. We first brought 12 children into the lab ranging from ages 8 to 15 for a pilot study to test the feasibility of this task. From this pilot, we learned that 360 trials was sufficient and doable for the kids. This takes about 25 minutes with explanations and breaks. We also found that different children needed vastly different numbers of trials for adequate thresholding. So we optimized our quest procedure by having it end whenever a participant reached a 95% confidence interval, rather than after a set number of trials. Finally, we experimented with providing auditory cues for correct and incorrect responses and found that, as seen in this figure, the response cues dramatically increased the amount of false alarms per participant. A false alarm is when a participant responds to trials where no color change was present, and this indicates that the participant might be guessing. Without auditory cues, there are barely any false alarms, making the data much more reliable. Next, we tested a small group of 5 children where we implemented the lessons learned in our pilot and analyzed the hit rates over the variable cue target intervals for the conditions where the blue cloud and the red cloud each underwent a color change. From looking at the hit rate, we can see a rhythmic pattern starting to emerge where some of the cue target intervals produced higher hit rates and others produce lower hit rates. To find the frequency at which this rhythmic oscillation is occurring, we perform Fourier transforms of the hit rates to find peak frequencies and calculated significance thresholds, the dotted lines, using permutation testing. Even though this is a small initial group of 5 children, we can see that, especially in the blue cloud, a peak is starting to emerge in the theta range. As we move forward with this study, we plan to expand into a school setting and collect sufficient data for both of our age groups. If we find that the rhythmicity of these 2 age groups is significantly different from each other, we plan to collect additional data for the ages in between in order to get a more holistic picture of the developmental trajectory of this process. Future directions potentially include using this paradigm to understand if this rhythmicity is altered in neurological conditions such as ADHD that present with atypical attention function. Finally, I'd just like to thank all of our participants, the Kastner Lab, and our funders, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ivette. Very interesting. I have like 100 questions, but yeah, I'll just go ahead and ask them. So first one is, I probably missed it. Why would you think the rhythmicity would change during development? What is the underlying hypothesis?
Yeah, so there's many studies that have shown that attention is basically not fully developed in children, and attention itself is still developing throughout childhood. Attentional processes are a little bit slower in younger children, and then they mature towards adult sort of standard. So that's one reason we think that perhaps this is probably reflected in these attentional rhythms. Also, just structural studies also show that areas that control attention are also not fully developed in children. So these different factors sort of lead us to believe that if attention isn't fully matured, that it's also possible that these rhythms aren't fully matured in children. And in terms of a specific hypothesis, we think that it's very possible that these rhythms aren't fully, that this rhythmicity isn't fully set in children yet. So this rhythmicity sort of represents a communication, sort of a control between sensory and motor areas, this allowing you to switch between sensory and motor control. So we think that perhaps we won't be able to detect a sort of developed rhythm in children just because they don't have this sort of developed connectivity yet. Or alternatively, the rhythm in children might be might just be a completely different rhythm than one of adults. So in ADHD, for example, there's different types of ADHD presents in different ways. So some children with ADHD present as being hyper-focused, where they get into these periods of being locked in, and other kids with ADHD get are very hyperactive, where they're unable to lock in. So we think that perhaps in children with this hyper-focus, where they stay locked in, perhaps what they have is a very, very slow rhythm where they stay in this locked in phase and very rarely get the opportunity to sort of switch to something else that might be relevant. And in contrast, the ADHD children that present as more hyperactive might have a very fast switching rhythm that allows them to sort of not sustain attention for a long period of time.
Yeah, thanks. I think it makes sense to hypothesize that children are still suboptimal, let's say, in the sense of how they deploy attention. The mechanism hasn't fully matured yet. But I'm just thinking this rhythmicity, how much is it intrinsic to our circuit, the neuronal circuit that we have to live with, and how much is it dependent on the environment? You know, like you can totally imagine that I can totally design a task where the distractors would appear at a frequency or phase that this kind of theta rhythm is not optimal, right? So yeah, what do you think about it? I don't know. So where does this? Why is this rhythmic activity so important? Is it to best capture the environment, or is it something intrinsic in our gene? Well, I should say something intrinsic in our like neuronal hardware, that it has to produce something like theta for attention to function.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question fully, but in a way, I think maybe a little bit of both, in that I think it's this sort of oscillation is a mechanism that your brain uses to coordinate connectivity and prioritize different regions. And I think this is sort of an intrinsic mechanism that the brain uses in a lot of different ways. And attention is one way in which it's using sort of oscillations to coordinate behavior, sort of in this case, by prioritizing either sensory perception, so attention, or motor activity, like the ability to move away and capture something in your surrounding that you might not, giving you the ability to sort of like look away and capture something else. But I also, but I think it also develops sort of in a way to best sort of to sort of give you like an optimal sort of response in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I kind of get it. Thanks. So there's a question from one of our panelists. So Jack Morgan, you want to unmute and ask the question yourself?
Sure. Great talk, Ivette. I guess I'm curious about sort of response times in this task. Like, would you expect that to relate to the theta rhythm in any way, or the emergence of the theta rhythm across development?
That's a really good question. So we do look at response times. We don't find it directly related to the theta rhythm, but we do use response times to sort of get rid of, participants that aren't performing well or participants that are guessing, but we don't really see this connection between if you're in a good phase, you respond quicker, and if you're in a bad phase, it takes longer. We more see it if you're in a bad phase, they're just more likely to get it wrong and miss the response.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd just be curious with like a drift diffusion modeling or anything like that, if anything would emerge between sort of a good phase and bad phase in terms of response bias and things like that.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to look at.
So there's another question from the audience. Jao asked, there is some evidence that infant-directed speech from mothers changes from a signal with more power on the delta band to a signal with more power in the theta band as infants get older. Do you think infants have a more delta-like attention span? So sort of, do you see that as an extrapolation to your data?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And not something I'd really thought about, but I definitely think so. I definitely think that it's possible that in childhood, kids are using different frequencies. So I wouldn't think before they approach sort of like the theta band adult, sort of like fully mature frequency. So I wouldn't find it too surprising to find that if you could test this in infants, for example, that they would display a different frequency, possibly a delta frequency or something like that.
Yeah, I think it some way it relates back to my question, which is why is theta so special, right? So some previous literature has suggested, because we know that eye movements are on a theta have theta rhythmicity, and when you look at covert spatial attention, for example, then very conceivably, because you have more or less the same circuit for oculomotor have for eye movements and covert spatial attention, then it is probably you are probably sampling back and forth in space, with the eye movement circuit, and that's why you have the theta rhythmicity. But it's not the case at all in your task, right? It's they are at the same place. The two dot patches are in the same place, and you still see it.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's something. Yeah, that's something that I think needs to be explored a little bit more. So we went. This is more commonly probed in sort of these covert attention tasks. Definitely not a foveal task. And the reason we ended up going with a foveal task for children is because it is a lot easier to perform the task. And we were happy to see that you can still capture this effect. But I think more work definitely needs to be done to sort of understand the difference between sort of what exactly is going on in this more feature-based attention versus like the spatial-based attention, and perhaps maybe what the differences in this rhythmicity might mean in these two different cases.
Yeah, speaking of that, the stimuli being foveal, how well is your eye tracking with the children? Like,
yeah, so we started, we're basically what I'm trying, our eye tracking isn't great. So we decided, we did a pilot study where we basically looked at the eye tracking and didn't find any. We were hoping that in the microsaccades we would find
yeah, exactly.
Rhythmicity, but when we did it in this task, because it is foveal and because there's so much movement going in within the fovea, this like movement and grading dot clouds sort of provoke a lot of microsaccades. So we weren't able to capture any rhythmicity in the microsaccades because there's just so much stimuli-induced activity. So when we first found that in an adult pilot. And when we first brought these kids in, we decided against doing eye tracking for them for that reason, just because we didn't really find anything very interesting in the microsaccades. So yeah, so we basically aren't tracking that anymore. And then a second reason being that because for this particular behavioral study, we want to collect just a large amount of data. We wanted to be able to go into schools, take these tasks into schools and collect large cohorts of children. For this behavioral study, it wasn't practical to also to expect that we'd also be able to do eye tracking in this phase of the experiment. We wouldn't be able to take sort of the eye tracking equipment into a school, for example. So for this phase, basically, we aren't eye tracking. Perhaps for a future study, if we decide to go in the direction of doing like EEG or something like that, then we might eye track with a smaller cohort of children that we bring into the lab.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Since we still have a little